Well, good evening. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's a delight to welcome you here to the Fall 2022 Patricia and Augustus Tagliaferri Dean's Distinguished Lecture. It's appropriate that we should be doing this on Veterans Day, so to all, happy Veterans Day. I don't know if you had a chance to see the theme tower or the cross tower on the way in, but maybe on the way out you'll notice that we've lit that up purple here at the university. It is the 240th anniversary of the Purple Heart, and so Pepperdine, as it always does, treats these occasions with dignity. We are here tonight for a number of reasons, but primarily due to the graciousness of one Gus Tagliaferri. It was Gus who several years ago endowed this lecture, and as we often did, met usually for coffee, usually over at Stonehouse, to discuss who the next lecturer was going to be. And over the course of several years before Gus passed away, we had, as you'll see here in the brochure piece, a number of really terrific lectures. That responsibility for selecting our lecturers and planning out these events has now passed on to Gus's son, and so he is here with us tonight with his sister Karen. Please join me in welcoming Michael and Karen here to this conference today. As you see from the brochure piece, we have had a number of terrific lectures here over the last several years. All of them have spoken really at the intersection of great ideas and American policy, whether that's domestic policy or foreign policy. And tonight's lecture is certainly no different. It is an honor to welcome tonight's lecturer, Robert C. O'Brien, who is our newest distinguished senior fellow here at the School of Public Policy. The format for tonight's discussion will be Ambassador O'Brien will offer a few minutes of remarks here at the podium. Then the two of us will sit down here for a conversation. And then, as we always do for the Tagliaferri lectures, we are going to open up the conversation to questions from you all. I believe that you should have question cards in your brochure pieces, so please be thinking about your questions as we move through our conversation. Robert C. O'Brien is the co-founder and chair of American Global Strategies, a Washington-based strategic advisory firm, and is a partner emeritus at Larson LLP here in Los Angeles. He was the 27th United States National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021. I'll say as a side note, it was on September 17th, 2019 that I learned that Robert may be getting that assignment, because it was on September 18th, 2019 that we were scheduled to have Ambassador O'Brien give our Constitution Day lecture. That evening, we happened to have an unrelated event in Beverly Hills I was at, and I got this call, and on the other end of the phone, I did not recognize the number, was the voice of a young lady who said, "Please hold the line for Ambassador O'Brien." I then learned from Ambassador O'Brien that he was somewhere proximate to Air Force One, and for reasons he couldn't tell me, he let me know that he was not going to be at the Constitution Day lecture. Come to find out the next day, the announcement went forth that he was named our 27th National Security Advisor. He served there as the President's principal advisor on all aspects of American foreign policy and national security affairs. O'Brien brought a renewed focus to defense and industrial base issues, which we'll talk about tonight, to the National Security Council. Previously, O'Brien was U.S. alternate representative to the 60th session of the United Nations General Assembly. He also served as a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs with the personal rank of ambassador, and he was directly involved in the return of more than 25 detainees and hostages to the United States. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming former Ambassador and National Security Advisor Robert C. O'Brien.
Well, thank you. It's good to see you all tonight, and thanks for that kind introduction, Pete, and Michael and Karen. Thank you and your parents for the legacy of hosting this lecture every year. It's an honor to be here, and I've seen some of the folks who were here before, and I thought, gosh, that's kind of a letdown if you were here for Victor Davis Hanson or Niall Ferguson. Now you just got me, but I'm privileged to be here. I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief this evening because Q&A is always a lot more fun to hear what you're interested in, and I won't talk about Area 51. I know a lot of people probably want to talk about the aliens in Area 51, but I can't talk about that. But I do want to talk tonight about something very serious, and that's what's happening in Ukraine. It's been almost 9 months now since the Russians brutally invaded and attempted to occupy the country of Ukraine. And it's clear that Vladimir Putin badly miscalculated in seeking to invade and occupy Ukraine. But the consequences of the Ukrainian people have been terrible. 7 million Ukrainians are displaced, some internally, but most of them in other places in Europe. I had breakfast last week with the German ambassador. She said there are 1 million Ukrainians in Germany now, and they've had their lives disrupted. They've had their cities destroyed, their daycare centers, their schools, their hospitals. It's been a terrible thing. But they're fighting back, and they've shown a lot of courage and bravery and panache and boldness in pushing back on the Russians. And today we had some good news in Kherson. It looks like that city's been liberated, and the Ukrainians are going to push on. So, I think we're watching a bit of a legend formed before us with President Zelensky. In some early conversations and speeches, I kind of compared it to like, hey, we're seeing something like Davy Crockett or Hector of Troy. And then my wife reminded me, like, it didn't end well for either Davy or Hector. And so hopefully it'll do a little bit, that President Zelensky will do a little bit better than Hector and Davy did, and have a long life and a free and prosperous Ukraine. But they're going to have to continue to make great sacrifices. And the people of Europe are going to have to make great sacrifices, especially as we approach the winter without Russian oil and gas. And one of the things that I was proud of that we did in the Trump administration is we worked very hard to put sanctions on companies and countries that were contributing to the building of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because Vladimir Putin used that pipeline and Russian oil and gas to gain leverage over our European allies, so that in an event of an invasion, as we saw in Ukraine, he could try and break them off from us. And I've now had a number of Germans, parliamentarians, and others have approached me, and I've been actually quite surprised by it. And they've said, you were right, President Trump was right. We shouldn't have done this Nord Stream 2 thing. We should have developed alternate sources of energy. We should have built a pipeline from Lisbon through Portugal and Spain and France to bring U.S. LNG to those terminals in Portugal and bring them to Germany that way. Excuse me, I flew out from Washington today. It was kind of a busy week, as you may have followed in Washington, and I was there for the week and watching with interest some of the returns and that sort of thing. And we can talk about that later. But because of the lack of foresight, and because the Russians had made an effort to create a dependency in Western Europe on their oil and gas, we're going to have a cold winter. It's going to be a very cold winter for the people of Ukraine. So the oil and gas and the heating oil and the electricity was going to be scarce to begin with. But the Russians are engaged in a brutal campaign of trying to take out all of the Ukrainian infrastructure to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And I'll tell you one thing, I don't think they're going to do it. And they're trying to break the will of the other people and the other European neighbors in Eastern Europe. Lomri, my wife and I were at a defense conference in Prague just recently. And all over the Czech Republic, Czechia, there are Ukrainian flags at every government building, at churches, at schools. That yellow and blue flag is everywhere. And I'd ask the people and talk to them and say, well, aren't you worried about the winter? And they said, well, we would rather freeze than let the Russians do to the Ukrainians what they did to us in 1968. They still talk about Václav Havel and all of his friends and They have relatives and grandparents that were jailed by the Russians, and I think they're going to stay strong. And I think the bipartisan consensus to support the Ukrainian people is going to stay strong. I think there are some voices on the left and the right in this country that are concerned. They don't want to have a war, and we don't want another forever war. That was one of the things we tried to do in the Trump administration, was end some of our forever wars, to bring our troops home to America or reposition them in the Asia-Pacific region where we could defend against the existential threat to our country, the Communist Party of China. So we don't want another forever war, but this is different. This is the Ukrainian people fighting themselves. They're not asking for Americans to fight. They're not asking for our sons and daughters and brothers and sisters and parents to go fight for them. They're fighting for themselves. What they're asking for us is to be the arsenal of democracy, is to do what we've traditionally done for our allies, and to give them the MRLS systems, the HIMARS, the artillery, the drones, the anti-aircraft weapons. Give them what they need to defend themselves so they can take the fight to the Russians and not us. Now, one issue that's a fair issue that some of our friends talk about is where are the Europeans? Why are we spending more than all of Europe combined on Ukraine? And it's a fair question. We can't care more about Ukraine. We can't care more about Europe than the Europeans care about Ukraine, and the Europeans care about Europe. So I'll compliment the Biden administration. I don't always do that, as you can imagine. But I'll compliment them on one thing. We failed in deterring Russia. We didn't stop the invasion from happening. But once it did happen, we've done a good job rallying our allies. And what we have to do now is redouble that effort. And we need to go to the Germans and the French and the British. The British are actually pretty good on this. And we need to insist that they contribute as much to Ukraine, the rebuilding of Ukraine, the arming of Ukraine, the support of the Ukrainian economy, as the American taxpayers do. And I think when that happens, that broad bipartisan consensus will remain intact when it comes to Ukraine. Now let me talk about one other issue. I'm not going to spend a lot of time up here talking about Ukraine and Russia. I want to talk about China. Because the number one audience for what's happening today in Ukraine, well, maybe I should say it's the number two audience. The number one audience is, of course, the people in Ukraine and the Zelensky administration in Kiev. But beyond Ukraine, it's not Western Europe, it's not Washington, D.C., it's Beijing. Because the Communist Party of China has announced, and in no uncertain terms, that they are preparing for war. And they've announced that during the next term, that President Xi is in office, and he just got a 5-year term. He's now basically a dictator for life. China will take Taiwan. And that's a disaster for the U.S. geopolitically and otherwise. It's like pulling the cork out of the champagne bottle in the Pacific. The PLA Army and Navy will flow out all the way to the shores of California with their nuclear boats that'll pour out to Alaska, Hawaii. All the islands, our grandparents and great uncles and fought for, Wake and Midway and the Solomons and Micronesia, everywhere. The PLA Navy there'll be no stopping them. But also think about the chips that you use. Every computer here, every phone here, every one of you has a smartphone. 95% of the chips, the advanced semiconductor chips, are made by a company called TSMC in Taiwan. If China can't make them, we make some. We're going to try and build more with the CHIPS Act. But if China got a hold of that technology that they haven't been able to replicate by stealing it or through intellectual property theft, if they get a hold of that monopoly, it'll be worse than OPEC with oil. They'll control the chip market. Every dishwasher, every car, every toy that your kids want to play with, every phone, every computer, China will control those chips. We can't allow that to happen. And then one last point on Taiwan, why it's important. It's important because Taiwan's a democracy. It's one of the great success stories of the 20th century. It was an autocracy, and it became a democracy over the last 30 years. If you've been to Taiwan, you know the people there enjoy our values. They enjoy our lifestyle. They go to movies on Friday nights. It's the Asian country that, although it's successful economically, it doesn't have the edge of some of the other places in Asia. It's like here. It's like us. And we need to make sure that we protect that democracy, we protect those values. But it's the fact that it's a democracy. It's the fact that there are human rights. It's the fact that there are Chinese people showing that capitalism and free markets and free men and free women and a democracy are compatible with the Chinese culture. The Chinese Communist Party would tell you you can only rule the Chinese people through totalitarianism, through a total surveillance society, through throttling the will of the people. Taiwan has shown that that's not true. And so it's a threat to the legitimacy of the party. So what is Xi looking at? And I'm going to go off script and just summarize this a little faster. Number one, Chairman Xi sees that it's tough to invade a modern industrial country. This is not Syria. Ukraine's not Syria or Iraq or some country in Africa, Libya. This is a modern industrial country. And when the people have the will to fight, it's tough. The sledding's tough. And he's also seen that the United States and our allies have been prepared to stand behind our partner. Like Taiwan, which is not a member of a formal alliance structure, Ukraine's not part of NATO. And yet we've given the Ukrainian people the tools that they need to fight back and to fight hard. And so I think one of the things that he's watching is the courage of the Ukrainian people, and two, the willingness of the United States and our allies to support the people of Ukraine in their fight. We've got to do the same thing with Taiwan, but we've got to do it with Taiwan now. We can't wait for fighting to start, because unlike Ukraine, where we could drive over the Polish border and deliver armaments and ammunition, it's going to be a very tough sledding to get our ships and our aircraft into Taiwan, an island nation, in the midst of a war. So what we need to do now is give Taiwan the weapon systems it needs, the missiles, the javelins, the stingers, the things that worked well in Ukraine. We've got to get it to them now so that we can turn them into a porcupine, an unappetizing porcupine for the big red dragon next door. And the Taiwanese people need to start preparing for that war, and they need to prepare for it now. Number two, I think that that China is looking at their potential invasion of Taiwan, and they're concerned because they've been training with the Russians for many years. The last time the Chinese fired a shot in anger was in 1979 in Vietnam. It did not go well for them. Now, I don't take a whole lot of pride in that, because it didn't go well for us a couple of years earlier in Vietnam. So Vietnam's a tough place. But up until now, the Chinese, there's really no one in China, or very few members of the Chinese military, that have experience from that war. There are some senior generals. So how have they been getting their experience? They've been doing live exercises, massive exercises with the Russians. And they look at the Russians as the gold standard. The Russians won in Chechnya. They won in Georgia. They took Crimea. They were in Libya. They've done well in Syria. And so they thought, if we can be like the Russians, we'll be fine. I think right now, Xi Jinping is looking at the Russian troops and at their equipment and saying, hey, maybe that's not quite so good up against the West and up against a motivated enemy. So I think that's a good sign for us. Third, Xi's looking at what happened with NATO. And you think, why would Xi be concerned about NATO? He's seen Russia attempt to drive a wedge in NATO with this invasion. He thought that, and certainly Putin thought that by Russia invading Ukraine, Germany, Italy, Greece, some of the other countries, Hungary, would sunder from the traditional Western allies of France and the United Kingdom and Canada and the United States, and they drive a wedge through NATO. What happened instead? NATO stuck together, and then Finland and Sweden joined NATO, countries that had long histories of neutrality through world wars, and they brought very capable forces to NATO and made things worse for Russia than it was at the beginning. Now, Xi is very worried about something called the Quad. It's a diplomatic arrangement between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. And he's worried that the Quad will go from a diplomatic shop to a military alliance. And guess what? If that happens, it's bad for him. But what's really bad is if the other countries that have treaty relationships with the United States join the Quad. So this new South Korean president has said he's interested in the Quad. Thailand and the Philippines both have military alliances with the United States. They could join the Quad. The United Kingdom and France have possessions in the South Pacific. They could join the Quad. You could have you might even have Vietnam, which unlike all the other countries I mentioned, is not a democracy, but believes in its sovereignty and believes in its independence and will fight like heck to keep it. That could be a very, very powerful military alliance, all aimed at China. And other countries would look between those two alliances. They'd look at China and a future with China, or they'd look at the U.S. and you could see even some of the other ASEAN countries joining that. So I think he's seen what happened with respect to NATO, and he's concerned that a similar type event could take place following an invasion of Taiwan. So I think those first three factors are good for us. The fourth factor is the economy, and that's not so good for us, because our sanctions on Russia in response to this invasion have really been half measures. The Russian federal Federation Central Bank should have been sanctioned. It hasn't been sanctioned. And so they're allowed to go on and sell their oil and gas, their commodities, their minerals that they extract, farm goods. All that is being sold now. And people say, yeah, but everything else has been sanctioned. What else do the Russians sell? I mean, when's the last time one of you went on Amazon and said, hey, I need that newest thing from Russia, right? When did you order something from Russia? Never. So we've left their economy relatively intact. And recently, a think tank in Beijing did a study, and it showed that Putin himself personally has made money off the war, and Russia has made money because of the increased price of oil and gas. And so I think China, which is an export economy, doesn't want to be sanctioned, is looking at this and thinking, if we can't decouple the Russian economy, which is like the size of the New Jersey economy, from the world, from the West, how can we do it to China? And they're taking some solace in that, thinking, well, the West isn't that serious. We need to get more serious in how we're dealing with the Russians. And if we want to see peace between Ukraine and the Russians, it's not appeasing Putin. It's not giving him parts of Ukraine. It's not going hat in hand. It's going to him and saying, the next level of sanctions is going to put you guys totally out of business, at least as far as the West goes. Now there's an attraction to appeasement. Appeasement's always popular, and it's popular in a democracy, because with appeasement you put off the tough choices, you put off the conflict for down the road. We all want to do that. When we think back what happened with Munich when Chamberlain came home from appeasing Hitler with the Munich Accords, and they gave Sudetenland, a chunk of Czechoslovakia, just as people are now suggesting that we give a chunk of Ukraine to Russia, and that will sate the dictator. What did it do? It only warmed up his appetite. It didn't causes Hitler to say, I've got everything I need now. I've got the Sudeten Germans with me. I'm done. It increased his appetite for more conquest. That will happen with Russia. So we can't appease them. We've got to show a policy of peace through strength to the Russians. That means rebuilding our military, helping our allies rebuild their militaries, and showing that we're not going to put up with the breach of sovereignty, the change of the international order. Something that we really thought was done after World War I. Now, Hitler came along and Mussolini came along. But after World War I, the idea that you could gain good title to territory, that you could take over your neighbor because you are bigger or had a bigger army or more powerful, that really became passé. It actually became illegal with the League of Nations. It certainly became illegal after World War II with the Charter of the UN. And yet, Putin decided because he was bigger and stronger, he could simply conquer Ukraine and take good title to it. We can't allow that to happen in the world. It'll become a very brutish, dangerous place. Now, there's a lot of other challenges. We can talk about them with Pete, whether it's Iran or talk more about the China challenge. We can talk about what's happening in North Korea, global jihadism. So it's sobering news, and it's unfortunately with my old job as National Security Advisor and Jake Sullivan, who's got the job now. You get up every morning, you get the intel brief, the presidential daily briefing, the other intelligence briefings, and you kind of there are days you go, gosh, how are we going to get through today, and how do we make progress? Let me give you some hope. There is still no other country like the United States of America. As tough as things are, and I take you in California, as tough as things are here with taxes and everything we've got to deal with, you don't see people climbing into the wheel well of an aircraft at LAX or hanging onto the wings and trying to get out of California or trying to get out of the United States. People are flocking here. They're coming here. Why? Because we have a constitution, because we've got the rule of law, because we've got a democracy, because we're still the place where everyone wants to innovate. Everyone wants to come here. Even the Chinese communists. I love the Chinese people. They're wonderful people. They're like us. They're hardworking. They're smart as heck. They're innovative. We see that they're great immigrants here. They all want to be here. And even the Chinese Communist Party, their central committee, over half the members of their central committee have homes, or their kids have homes in California, in San Marino, and Palos Verdes, and or up in Vancouver in Canada, and our neighbor to the north. They all want a bug-out place here. They all want a bolt hole here, because we're still, as Ronald Reagan talked about, the last best hope of mankind on earth. We're still that shining city on the hill. We're going to get through our domestic problems. We're going to get through our issues. We're going to pull together as a people, and we're going to. And so my last bit of advice to you: bet on the U.S. Don't bet on China. Don't bet on Russia. Don't bet on Iran. Bet on the U.S. and our allies and our friends around the world. Bet on freedom. We're going to prevail. It's going to be a rocky road, but we're going to get there. So With that, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to talking with Pete. God bless you, and God bless America.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Bryan, for those table-setting remarks. Again, just as a reminder, we're going to go to questions from you all. You have question cards in your brochure, and at some point, those will be collected, thrown into a fire, and destroyed. But I want to start actually on a more personal note. I know we have a number of students here in the audience. And I mentioned that story on September 17th, getting that phone call from you. So great to actually have you here on campus after a couple of swings and misses.
Yeah, I did that whole thing to avoid the lecture. I hadn't prepared a lecture yet, and so I engineered the whole thing to avoid having to come to the speech. So.
Very effective.
Not a lot of people know that.
Very effective. Could you talk a little bit about what it was like? Just obviously, you were an ambassador already. You were in the administration, and you were working on some amazing projects, releases of detainees, Americans. We might get into the Griner story at some point in the discussion this evening, but for now, could you take us into what it was like to get that tap on the shoulder, and then that first week of being the national security advisor, what that was like?
Yeah, so the first thing is this is kind of a silly thing, but I'd interviewed with the president the night before. I'd interviewed with him in Washington the week before, and I'd come home for the weekend to be with my family, and he was doing a fundraiser in Beverly Hills. And we went to the fundraiser, he pulled me aside, I interviewed with him again, and I thought he'd offer me the job. Pete Wilson was with me, and I said, Pete, I think I've got the job. And Pete said, well, I'm not sure. Don't tell anyone. I said, okay, I won't say anything. And the next morning, about 6:30 in the morning, Lomri, my wife's phone blew up, and people were saying congratulations. And the news had been out that I was being interviewed for the position, so that wasn't a surprise. But I assumed people were just congratulating her on the fact that I met with the president and talked about it. And she turned on the TV, and I don't know why the TV was on CNN, because that normally wouldn't happen in our household. Not that we all love CNN, but there was a tweet on CNN that said, congratulations, my new National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. So I learned about my appointment by tweet. And so I understood some people have been fired by tweet.
But to be hired.
Hoping to avoid that. And so as soon as I started to get up, I thought, gosh, I got to get organized. The phone rang, and it was Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff at the time. Right. And Mick said, we've got a call with Boris Johnson in 15 minutes. I need you down in the president's suite. And Mick just assumed I was traveling with the president, because when the president travels, this whole bubble goes with him. I was in Pasadena. I said, Mick, I'm
not going to make it.
I'm in my pajamas in Pasadena. I'm just getting up. And he said, well, you better be here in an hour, because we're not waiting for you. And Air Force One is leaving. And I thought, the only Air Force One I'd been on was at the Reagan Library. And so I quickly got ready and enlisted my wife as my driver. And we rushed off. Fortunately, I threw a tuxedo. I had an apartment in Washington, so I threw a few things together. But fortunately, I threw my tuxedo in a valet and took that. And I didn't know there was a state dinner that Friday, so luckily I had the right clothes. But we raced down to the Intercontinental, where the president's party was staying. But then we realized we were like a mile out. The checkpoint started, and no one had cleared me. I didn't have anything other than Mulvaney telling me. And I'm pretty good at talking my way through checkpoints. I've been in a bunch of third world countries over my life, and in various positions. So I held out my State Department ID and said, I'm Ambassador O'Brien, the new National Security Advisor. And fortunately, this LAPD lady said, okay, go through. And so we pulled up. Well, we pulled up in front, and no one was there. And Figueroa was, I think we were on Figueroa, was closed off. Mm-hmm. We pulled up in front. I pulled out my bags, kissed my wife goodbye. Now, I was later told by some guys on the CAT team, the counter assault team, that I was in the scope, of the rifle. Fortunately, no one pulled the trigger. And Lomri drove off, and I realized I'd left my cell phone. And so I went running after her to get my cell phone. Now I've left the bags in front of the President's Hotel, unattended.
In the scope.
To get my cell phone, and came back. By that time, there were a whole number of agents, and I love our Secret Service agents. They've taken wonderful care of me and my family over the last 3 years and 3.5 years, and they escorted. They said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Robert O'Brien, the new National Security Advisor." And they got on their mic, and someone said, "Okay, you can let him in." And within a few minutes later, I was in the Beast, the presidential limo with the president. I don't know what happened to my bags, and on Air Force One, and we were off to the border and a number of other things, and so work started pretty quickly without a lot of. There wasn't really an orientation program or training program. It was just kind of jumping right into it, and it was like that every day for a year and a half, and we got a lot done.
You mentioned before what a day was like, at least at the beginning. Was there ever kind of a typical day, at least as far as kind of, at least when you were in DC, start with a briefing and then so on?
Yeah, so there were typical days. There were a lot of days that weren't, because you just didn't know what was going to happen in the world that day. And there was every time you thought you'd have a day to get caught up and that there'd be a kind of a normal day, it never turned out to be that way. But on the normal days, and there were plenty of them, I usually get up about 6 in the morning and read all the newspapers and the trades, the defense trades, and then head into the office and get briefed by the Situation Room on the way into I had a classified phone in the SUV, and get briefed by the Situation Room. Then I get into the office and read the Presidential Daily Brief, and then I go through all the paperwork that came through the night before. I mean, what people don't realize is that there's a massive amount of paper that goes to the U.S. government that would either require my signature or the President's signature, and I was always amazed at how many things had to be signed by the President himself. And so I'd go through all that paperwork, and then I'd usually go into the President and go through what the issues were, the things I needed signed, and then we'd have meetings throughout the rest of the day running what's called the interagency process. And that's where we bring together the cabinet secretaries from the various departments and agencies of the federal government and deal with issues. Some were long-term issues like arms control or infrastructure and things of that nature. And other things were the crisis of the day. If there was an issue in North Korea that day, or if there was an issue in Cuba, or there was an issue with Iran. And we'd work with the interagency, and then we'd go take the President the best advice and counsel we had, get recommendations, and get his direction, and then we'd go back and have meetings to implement the President's decision. That's kind of the normal day of a National Security Advisor, but that was probably less than half the time.
So before we get into the hot spots and just drawing off of some of your remarks, I did, in prepping for this, and again, I think important for our students to understand the work that you did at NSC was not just strategic, but was also administrative. You wrote a piece just a month or so after being tapped as National Security Advisor for the Washington Post about streamlining the National Security Council. And in that piece, you talked about how much it had grown, the National Security Council had grown from its origins in the 40s, and then certainly a massive boost during the Obama administration. Talk a little bit about why you thought administratively, even a month into the office, that you thought this was something that the structure of the office itself, obviously with the supreme goal of maintaining American national security, but why you thought from an administrative perspective that this was such an important step to take.
Yeah, so this was something I thought about long before becoming National Security Advisor, because what had happened, and it happened over time, when John F. Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, he did it with 12 policy professionals from the NSC. By the time I got there were over 200 policy professionals at the NSC. And past presidents, especially on the Democrat side, kind of recreated the State Department. They recreated the Defense Department. They recreated the Treasury over in the old Executive Office building. And you had many State Departments and many Defense Departments trying to run policy and operate through the NSC and cut out our agencies and cabinet officials. My feeling was the State Department should do diplomacy. We've got a former ambassador of the State Department with us tonight. They should be running diplomacy. The Defense Department should be running defense. Treasury should be running the economy. If they were getting it wrong, then we should replace the cabinet secretary. but we got to give them the opportunity to run it and not micromanage from Washington, from the White House. And so I thought that was very important. Number two, it's just bureaucratically unwieldy when you've got that many people running around trying to get on your calendar, everyone with a different policy agenda, trying to push things up. It was unwieldy. And so the way that some of my predecessors had handled it is they had 5 or 6 deputies. I also thought that was not the right way to go. I think you should have one deputy, a chain of command, because every deputy at the NSC can summon the other deputies of the departments for meetings. And so if you have a deputies committee meeting, and those are very important meetings to coordinate U.S. policy and to get the advice of the president that we needed to. If there are 6 deputies and they're calling the Deputy Secretary of State for 6 different meetings a week, the Deputy Secretary of State can't get his job done. He can't do any work back at the building because he's constantly coming for coordination meetings at the White House. And I thought that was unfair to the folks who were actually implementing policy. So I was very fortunate. I had a good relationship with a lot of my predecessors. There are 27 of us. I think about half of us are still alive. But the first person who came back to see me, I came into office on a Wednesday, got to D.C. on Thursday. On Sunday, Condi Rice came back to Washington and sat in my office, and it was her old office, so it was a little surreal. I'd worked for Secretary Rice in the Bush administration at the State Department, several rungs below, so to have, I'm calling her Madam Secretary, and she's like, Robert. It's Condi and Robert now, and which was, and she was incredibly cordial. But I asked her about this issue. I said, how many people did you have? She said, we had 100 people. And we did a pretty good job. We had Afghanistan, Iraq, the war on terror, Russia, China, everything. We were able to do it very well with 100 people. And what Condi liked about that is she could look at a memo. 100 people you can get to know. Over 100 people, it's pretty tough to get to know folks. And she was able to look at the memo, and if she had a question about a policy issue or research or that sort of thing, she could punch her phone and reach down and call the person who wrote the memo and get it straight from the horse's mouth. It's hard to do that when you have 200, 250, 300 people. And so she gave some great advice, and I ultimately implemented it.
Yep.
We did what was the equivalent of a private sector reduction of force, and we reduced the size of the NSC. And I think that reduction of size and the confidence that we placed in the other departments and agencies gave them the incentive to do a good job and to do not sit back and say, well, the White House is doing this for us. I think we got some great policy out of it as a result.
Let's go down
we
to,
got more done with fewer people.
and I think that is a lesson that could be applied to a number of different bureaucracies, both private and public
Court
sector.
not here at Pepperdine.
Let's get to some of the hotspots. One of the things that we teach here at the policy school, especially in the national security track, is that leaders look at one another. That even though an event is happening over here, it's not worth focusing purely on that without understanding that one event over here can be seen by others. And a perception can be made of what, not just the particular actors, but are other countries being involved. And you touched on this in the opening remarks here, just about how China is perceiving what's going on in the Ukraine. But I wanted to back up a second before that, because you've also spoken about how Putin perceived the United States prior to decisions going into the Ukraine. And one of the events in particular that you have discussed was pivotal in shaping Putin's view on what the response might be from the United States should he go into the Ukraine, was the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And there were some at the time, both pundits and others, who said, well, the Trump administration had spoken openly about reducing forces in Afghanistan. So the fact that President Biden, in the eyes of some, followed through on those original plans really shouldn't be seen as a moment of weakness as much as it is just a fulfillment of previously established strategy. Talk a bit about your view on, A, the Trump administration's view on America's role in Afghanistan, and then how you saw, after the withdrawal, that being perceived by others.
No, so that's a great question. We wanted to get out of the forever wars, and President Trump made it very clear to the world and to the American people that we had to get out of Afghanistan. It was time for the Afghans to solve their own problems, to stand on their own feet, that we could be a partner and support them, but they needed to come to some conclusion. This war had been going on for 20 years. And so we engaged with Zad Khalilzad, our ambassador and special envoy in Afghanistan, in a series of negotiations between the Taliban and the then current government of Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan to try and reach a peace. And we came up with a peace agreement that was signed by the parties themselves, the Afghans themselves, and signed by us, that would have led to our withdrawal from, eventually, a total withdrawal from Afghanistan. But there were conditions. And the conditions were that there be negotiations with the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban, that there be a transitional government, that there be no Americans killed, and that the Taliban, and this was the key for us, that the Taliban would assist us in eradicating the terrorists from Afghanistan, that Afghanistan could never become a safe haven again for ISIS, for Al-Qaeda, for JNM, for any of these groups, Islamic Jihad. They could then use Afghanistan to train and equip and prepare to attack the United States of America. And the Afghans didn't live up to that. So we thought about what would happen if we withdrew our troops from Afghanistan, and the president made a very courageous decision that we got to the level of 2,500 troops. We negotiated with NATO to have NATO give us 5,000 troops, twice as many European and allied troops as American troops were on the ground. We had 7,500 troops on the ground when we left office on January 20th, 2021. And the point of that was going to be sufficient. That number of troops would be sufficient to A, fulfill the president's campaign pledge to get us out of combat operations in Afghanistan, but B, would be sufficient to protect our embassy, to protect our counterterrorism agencies and intelligence agencies that were doing work there, and to allow time for this peace program that had been negotiated to be fulfilled. If the Afghans didn't live up to their commitments, the Taliban, and if they didn't knock off the terrorism, then we weren't pulling out those troops. And when we left office, Kabul was safe. Afghanistan was generally free and stable. There were issues. There hadn't been an American killed in Afghanistan for 17 months, and we felt we left it in a pretty good place. And unfortunately, things went sideways after that. And President Biden had made the same commitment that President Trump did, but he executed in a very different way than President Trump would have. We would have never left $30 or $40 billion, even if we decided we're getting out. We would have never gotten out by leaving, anywhere from $7 to $80 billion in equipment behind in Afghanistan. Can you imagine what Ukraine could do with all that equipment? And this wasn't just Humvees. I mean, this was rotary wing aircraft. This was ground attack fighters. I mean, these were sophisticated missile and drone systems. We left it all behind for the Taliban. I mean, we would have never done that. And it was a disgrace for the American taxpayers. But more important than the material, than the cost, we left hundreds of Americans behind. We didn't get them out. It was chaos trying to even evacuate our embassy. We left behind thousands of Afghans who we'd promised to give safe haven to because they'd been the interpreters and the enablers for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines who'd fought in Afghanistan for 20 years. And there was a bounty on their head if we left and didn't get them out with us. So the way we left was chaotic. It was disgraceful, and our allies, were unhappy with us. I can tell you that. I heard from many of them, but our adversaries took pleasure in it. They saw the U.S. being humiliated, and that then in turn encouraged them. I think encouraged President Putin to believe that the U.S. was now out of the great power game, that we were a weak country. He miscalculated. We're not a weak country, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a catastrophe, but it wasn't a symptom of overall weakness in America. And I think Putin took a look at that. And I think he also looked at some of the things that we did leading up to the invasion. And there was always the thought in the government, we faced it. We faced it at the Pentagon when we were in office. There were officials in the Pentagon that tried to keep us from giving the javelins to Ukraine, the Javelin anti-tank missiles that blunted the invasion, because they didn't want to provoke Vladimir Putin. And you heard that over and over again from the current administration. We don't want to provoke Putin. You know, guys, Putin's been provoked. Okay, he was provoked when he destroyed Chechnya. He was provoked when he took Crimea for the first time. He was provoked when he took half of Georgia. You know, he was provoked when he went into Syria and to Libya. And so the idea that if we were just nice to him and we didn't help the Ukrainians and we didn't give them the material that they needed to defend themselves, Putin wouldn't invade. And then I think the president made a very regrettable comment that I'm sure he regrets. You know, it was people misspeak, and of course, you know, I never misspoke, but I did plenty of times. Trust. I'd come home, and my wife would say, "What did you just say today?" I saw you on CNN. That was terrible. But the president said, "Well, maybe a minor incursion is okay." Well, I think Vladimir Putin looked at that as a green light. Combining that with our you know, unwillingness to provoke them, our unwillingness to sanction them, and watching what happened to Afghanistan, he thought he would have a very different you know, result in Ukraine than he received. So he miscalculated. But that's the problem. When even when we're not weak, if our enemies and our adversaries perceive us to be weak, that's provocative, and we need to make sure that never happens again.
And do you have a sense, just on that note, now we'll get to more current views in a second, but do you have a sense of how China saw that, the pullout, and what that would say about America's willingness? Obviously, there's a debate going on between the closeness of the American response in Afghanistan and the prospects for how they would act in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
Look, I think the Chinese took the same lesson from Afghanistan and from the early days of the administration that the Russians did, and that's not good. But as I discussed, I think they're maybe having some second thoughts at this point. The other thing, President Biden has said 4 times now that the United States would get involved militarily if China attacked Taiwan. Now, every time he's done it, you know, his staff runs out and says, "Oh, he didn't really mean it. He didn't." You know, they do what Washington calls walking it back, and so they walk it back every time. I was talking to another cabinet official in the Trump administration. And I looked at him and I said, "Could you imagine if we did that once with President Trump, but much less 4 times? I mean, you'd be carrying your box out of your office on West Exec, you know, getting in your car and leaving the White House for the last time." So the fact that his staff feels so emboldened to go do that says something about the way that things are being managed. But I think what President Biden's doing, and again, I have plenty of criticism for the president, this is something where I think he's on the right track. I think he's trying to restore deterrence and prevent the Chinese from invading and saying, "Hey, this is not Ukraine, this is not Afghanistan, we're going to get involved, and you can pay a very heavy price." I mean, back in the Reagan years, we used to talk about, and some of you are old enough, there's a lot of young people here, but we used to say, "Let Reagan be Reagan." And so my new slogan is "Let Biden be Biden," and you know, and at least when it comes to China, and we'll see what happens there. But I think the president has an instinct that he needs to do something different than he did in Ukraine, and unfortunately, his staff doesn't seem to have the same feeling.
So let's move to China, and you just touched on this, but one of the interesting things in the transition of administrations from President Trump to President Biden has been the issuance of the 2 national security strategies. First, obviously, the Trump administration in 2017, and then most recently with the Biden administration. And in looking at those 2 documents, a number of people have commented that the approach on China, which was the sea change, happened in the Trump administration, in your administration. But it's maintained at least somewhat similar. Josh Rogan had a piece in the Washington Post earlier this year in which he talked about Biden's and the administration's approach on China to be very much of a continuation from the initial break set by the Trump administration. Your thoughts on at least how the Biden administration is approaching China, and to what degree are you encouraged by the continuation or discouraged in the consistency with what the table that you set?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the areas where there is, and I think Josh is right. In fact, I was at Wilmer and I were at a dinner last night at the Nixon Foundation in Washington, a strategy summit, and I spoke there at the last evening, and Josh was at one of the tables, and sitting right next to him was Michael Pillsbury, who some of you may know, who wrote a very important book on China, and on the other side was Bridge Colby, a colleague of mine, who just recently wrote a book on China, very, very tough, hawkish on China. And I thought, man, the Chinese, they've got Rogan and Pillsbury and Elbridge Colby in the same place. This could be a dangerous place to be sitting. And of course, I don't think, they're not very happy with me either. I was sanctioned by the Chinese along with Mike Pompeo when we left office.
Right.
So I can't go to China, fortunately. I've been there and I've got no plans of vacation in Beijing. Look, the new strategy is a little muddled. So it's in many ways the Trump strategy, but it's written by people who wrote the Obama strategy, which was all about cooperating with our adversaries and creating a new world where the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans all get along and we attack climate change and that'll be we'll save the world. So yeah, the folks who wrote that trying to take ours and edit it, and so it's a little muddled. But for the most part, there's continuity on the China issue, and that's good news. I think we changed the bipartisan consensus on China during the Trump administration, and folks realized that the Communist Party of China, not the Chinese people, but the Communist Party of China, is the greatest threat that the United States faces for our long-term survival. And at least the survival of our way of life is of having liberty and democracy and the rule of law and free speech and all those things are so near and dear to us. And so I think there's continuity. I think the problem is that they're not being aggressive enough in pushing forward. So we got to a point that there's a lot more to do. I think we're at a little bit of a plateau right now, and I think there's further action that we can take on China, and we can do it, soon and need to do it now. And one of those things is rebuilding our military. The defense budget has nominally gone up in dollars from the time we were in office, but it doesn't account for inflation. And the inflation our defense contractors are facing isn't the 8 or 9 or 10% that you're seeing on the consumer front. You're seeing inflation in some things, in submarines and surface ships, up to 30 and 40%. So there's an effective cut in our defense budget of anywhere from 8 to 30%. And if we're going to deter the Chinese and let them know we mean business and that we could defend ourselves in a great power war, which we don't want to get in, again, the idea is to deter them, we've got to spend the money necessary to give our warfighters the platforms they need.
Well, let's talk about the spending, and I'll weave in one of the questions here from Ryan Brown. I'll ask his question, then I'll frame it in a larger context. What can the U.S. do to counteract the influence of China in Africa, which begs this larger question about the Belt and Road strategy that China has employed. You mentioned the CHIPS Act, which in some ways is an American industrial policy response to the matters that you mentioned before, where there's such a dramatic concentration of microchip manufacturing in Taiwan. The Belt and Road strategy, which has essentially spread Chinese influence throughout the world in ways that I don't think, frankly, most Americans understand. I mean, I don't know if you and I ever discussed this. My dad happens to live in Australia, and as an expat living in Australia, he is regularly looking at the news and seeing China's influence throughout the South Pacific. And on a call recently, he said, Pete, the Chinese have just are building a deep water port in Jamaica. And I said, no, that can't be true. And then I looked it up, and sure enough, the Chinese are building a deep water port in Jamaica. And obviously that's happening throughout Latin America. It's happening in Africa. To the point, we had an event here recently with a gentleman by the name of Siddharth Kara, who's got a new book coming out on the Chinese, essentially, ownership of the cobalt mines in the Republic of the Congo. What can the United States do from an industrial policy economic standpoint to respond? Well, maybe I should back up first. How effective do you think Belt and Road is? And then second, what should the United States be doing to counteract it if it's effective?
Yeah, so Belt and Road, for those of you who don't know, is basically the Chinese go to countries and offer them loans. And with those loans, they can build infrastructure projects, and then they're built by the Chinese. So they bring in Chinese labor. They don't use domestic labor. They use Chinese labor. They always pay a big bribe to the leader of that country, and that money goes straight to Switzerland or the Caymans or somewhere to pay that person. And they keep a deed of trust on the infrastructure project. So whatever they build, whether it's a port or a stadium or a railway, they've got a mortgage on it. And the terms are always opaque. The interest rates are predatory. And eventually the Chinese will come back in and either take the infrastructure back or they'll bankrupt the country. And this is happening in country after country, especially in Africa. And we call it debt trap diplomacy. But they keep getting away with it because they're willing to offer these bribes. It's incredibly corrupt. And so I had one African leader, I won't name him, of a major African country come to my office. And he said, the Chinese are terrible, this debt trap diplomacy, One Belt, One Road is a sham, it's a fraud. And I said, no, all those things are true. And he said, if you will pay off the Chinese for us just on this one thing, we'll never borrow any more money from them again. I said, you clearly don't understand who I work for. Yeah. Can you imagine me walking in the president and saying, we're going to pay off this country's debt to the Chinese, but they'll love us, they'll be our friends. Excuse me. So the idea that we would pay off the debts is a no-go. But what we do have to start doing is educating the people of these countries of how pernicious it is and how dangerous it is to go into business with the Chinese. And you're seeing that now in Sri Lanka, where the entire economy has been destroyed, and the Chinese are running Sri Lanka. We came up with an initiative called the Blue Dot Initiative, and that is any infrastructure project in the country. It's kind of like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. So we had our key allies, Australia, Japan, others. New Zealand signed on to it. It was especially to focus on the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific region. And that is if you wanted to invest in an infrastructure project or you wanted an infrastructure project in your country, you wanted to get the Blue Dot. And the Blue Dot meant that you did all kinds of things on corruption and on proper planning, environmental planning, on safety rules for the workers, on labor and employment rules. And if you met all those things, you get the Blue Dot seal of approval. And then the IMF and the regional banks and American contractors and European contractors would participate in your project, and you end up with a great project at the end of the day. And so again, it was very different than the debt trap diplomacy approach to the Chinese. So I think that's still going. I don't think it's got the same push behind it that we were putting behind it, but I think it's still in place, and that's one way to approach it. The other way is just we've got to educate these foreign leaders and foreign publics about what it means to do business with the Chinese. But they're starting to learn it. They're seeing that the Chinese will come into an African country and build a project and man it totally with Chinese workers, provide no training for the locals, not contribute to the local economy, and then whatever they extract, whether it's minerals or oil or in agricultural projects, the food, and they put it on rail cars and ship it straight to China, and the local people starve.
Yep.
I mean, it's worse than any form of colonialism we saw with the French or the British.
Yeah, I mentioned this Siddharth Kar in this forthcoming book. They're essentially running modern-day slavery operations in many of these cobalt mines in the Congo, and that needs to be understood as the way that China does business. One of the other things I don't think a lot of Americans are aware of, and you've spoken to recently, is the scope and scale of Chinese espionage in the United States. Talk a little bit about that, and then jumping a step forward, but related, how you view, as has been a topic of recent discussion, about TikTok and how the Chinese are using that platform.
So TikTok deleted from your phone if you got the app. You've signed a user agreement. You've given the Chinese access to everything on your phone, and TikTok regularly shares with the Ministry of State Security in China all the data it gets. So your passwords, your viewing history, your contact list, everything on your phone is basically the property of the Chinese Communist Party if you've got TikTok. Number one. Number two, they can track your location. And what I'm talking about now is all publicly reported. These have come out in reports recently. This is a real danger because if there's ever a crisis with China or there's a conflict with China, many of our young people in the military, pilots, surface warfare officers, etc., use TikTok. the Chinese are going to know exactly where they are. It's a lot easier to use a hit squad to kill a pilot than to shoot down an aircraft. They're going to, and if you can't get to the pilot himself because he's on the base, you're going to know where his wife and kids are, and be able to blackmail him. You're going to know where his bank account is. So if you got a captain on a destroyer going out to fight, and then all of a sudden his wife is texting him that their bank accounts have been wiped out, that their mortgage is being foreclosed on, because the Chinese have access to all the passwords for his bank. How is he going to concentrate on the fight when his wife's trying to say, what do we do? We've got no money. I can't feed the kids. I can't feed the family. Should I have your check deposited in the same bank account? Because every time money gets in there, it gets wiped out.
Yeah.
Those are the sorts of things that can happen with TikTok. The other thing with TikTok is the algorithms are, they're terrific. They figured out a way to really get in our head with TikTok. And I've talked to very senior tech titans here, multi-billionaire tech guys. They're all amazed at the TikTok algorithm. They have figured something out. You get on TikTok and it's like crack cocaine or something. You can't get off it. Now the algorithms in China focus on who won the math contest, who won the spelling bee contest, how great the party is, good citizenship, helping your community, all the good things in life. Here they focus on parties and drugs and dances, and there's a real effort. They focus on stoking political divisions between us. So the algorithm here is used to divide us and to make us, use a crude term, to make us stupider. And it's used there to bring people together and to make them smarter. And so TikTok's a bad thing. We banned it at the end of the Trump administration. Prime Minister Modi banned it in India. And unfortunately, the new guys came in and allowing the Keystone Pipeline to go forward, they decided to allow us to keep using TikTok. So that's a mistake I wish they hadn't have made. I think we're eventually going to get to a ban. Congressman Mike Gallagher in Wisconsin and Senator Marco Rubio in Florida just introduced legislation to ban TikTok into Congress. And I hope it passes by a super majority. By the way, I think there are a bunch of parents that will be happy to get their kids off TikTok anyway. So I think it's a political winner. Espionage. The Chinese espionage is pervasive here. It can't be overstated. You can't believe. And it's not just espionage, it's influence. But let me just give you one example. We decided to look into Chinese students who are studying here. And there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese students studying here. But we found about 3,000 of them were PLA, People's Liberation Army, or People's Liberation Army Navy officers who had lied on their applications, denied any connection with the Chinese military, and came here and studied. And we revoked their visas and sent them home. A number of them were also engaged in other espionage. It wasn't just that they were studying here, but they were engaged in espionage activity. And the worst part of it is we figured out there were more Chinese military officers studying at our universities than American military officers studying for advanced degrees in our universities. It was ludicrous. And so we put an end to that. Unfortunately, some of that has been rolled back because it's, apparently it's racist to, send, secret Chinese officers home. So, but we need to get back to taking a hard line on those sorts of issues. We want the legitimate Chinese students to come
Of course, right.
And if they want to stay and they get a great degree, staple a green card to their degree and get them to stay here, because they're the best immigrants we've got in this country. And so we want the ones that want to leave China and have freedom and are smart and are hardworking and contribute to our country, our culture. We want them to stay. We don't want the Chinese spies to stay.
Right.
So I think that's kind of a pretty easy line, but apparently it's tough and difficult for some of our friends to understand.
Let's turn our attention to the Middle East, and I'll weave in a question here from Colleen Graffey, who I'm so glad is able to join us here from the law school. I'll ask her question, and then we can go into the JCPOA, because this certainly is, unlike China, which the policies have remained somewhat consistent between Trump administration to Biden. In Iran, we are certainly seeing a break. So Colleen's question is, should the U.S. government be speaking out in support of the protests in Iran? And then parenthetically, Obama has stated it was a mistake that he didn't during the Green Revolution. So first, just about the protests that are happening there and how President Biden and the administration should be responding to that publicly, and then we can get into the JCPOA.
Yeah, so the protests are quite interesting. They've been more enduring than I think anyone thought would happen. I talked to a number of ambassadors from the region last week in Washington, and I think it took everyone by surprise that this is a real indigenous, enduring protest that's taking place, and it's really because women have decided that they don't want to be chattel anymore. They want to control their own lives, and there's a second part of it that's not being reported on, a human rights issue of gays and lesbians who are being like systematically hunted down and killed and thrown off buildings. They tie them to lawn chairs and throw them off buildings, or they stone them or they hang them, and so I've always found it interesting that like the left made a big deal about Obama. Obama had one foreign policy accomplishment. I don't think it was an accomplishment, but in the Obama universe, the JCPOA was their equivalent of the Abraham Accords. It was this wonderful achievement. It didn't work. It was demonstrably ineffective. The Iranians kept up with their nuclear program, and they took the $150 billion in sanctions relief they received, and they spent it on terrorists in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, all of the region, creating mayhem and murder and undermining our allies. So it didn't work. But there's this almost religious faith that we have to restore this for Obama. So we're now using the Russians who invaded Ukraine and are our adversary to negotiate with the Iranians on our behalf to try and get us back in the deal. I mean, it makes no sense. It's absurd.
As the Iranians are sending drones over to the Ukraine,
and now threatening to send ballistic missiles to the Russians to rain down on the people of Ukraine. I mean, it's an absurdity. But again, I think there's this feeling we have to restore this great thing that Barack Obama did. And look, I don't have anything against Barack Obama. It's just it was a terrible deal, and so that gets us back to this protest. We're watching history. It may not repeat, but it rhymes. And with the Green Revolution, President Obama's realized it was a mistake not to support the Green Revolution. We gave them we sent a lifeline to the regime in Tehran when the Green Revolution was taking place. We gave them billions and billions of dollars in sanctions relief in cash, and that allowed them to put down the revolution and stay in power. We now have a situation where they've lost total legitimacy, and that's one thing that the ambassadors from the region will tell you, is that the Iranian government may stay in power because they're willing to shoot the protesters, and they've got 150,000 IRGC Revolutionary Guard thugs who'll put a bullet in the head of every protester, every woman, every gay or lesbian protester out there, every parent of a woman or someone who's different than them. And many of these people are ethnic minorities as well. They're Azeris, they're Kurds, they're Armenians who are being killed by the ruling class is primarily Persian. And so there's an overlap between these protests and some of the ethnic divisions in the country. And it's just absolutely brutal what's happening. It's kind of an ethnic cleansing and may turn into a genocide. So I don't think there's much we can do to help them. We certainly don't want to take it over and give evidence for the regime to use that this is an American-inspired protest. But what we want to do with these protesters is let them know that we believe in what they believe in, that we're still the shining city on the hill, we're this beacon of liberty that Reagan pointed out. We didn't necessarily get involved in the Russian dissident movement, but the Russian dissidents all looked to America to give them hope that they can have freedom one day. We should be doing that for the Iranians. We should be making sure that they've got access to the internet. I mean, our tech companies can take down the firewalls and give Iran the choice of having no internet if they have to cut it totally off and cut their connections, or an internet that's free and open. We could drop Starlink. We could parachute Starlink uplink platforms to them and get Starlink to the Elon Musk company.
Right, as we've done in Ukraine.
To get uplinks so they could get on the internet. So there's a lot we could do to help the protesters without taking it over, without making it an American protest, but supporting what they do, primarily by being an example for them and by not helping the regime. But again, we're going to repeat history because they're just desperate to return to the JCPOA, which will in 2 or 3 years legitimize Iran as a nuclear power, give them billions of dollars in sanctions relief, and help them put down these protests again. And I was pleased to see President Obama's statement
Yep.
on recognizing they made a mistake. I think that may be the first time President Obama's ever done that. So that was encouraging. But I don't think it's going to stop his former employee, his former staffers who are now staffing the Biden administration from trying to shove this JCPOA through again.
So we're in our last 10 minutes here. I wanted to go through just a few, I wouldn't call it a lightning round, but maybe kind of a light rain round or something. Just a few quick questions. First, as you said in your introductory remarks, it was the week of a big election. The so-called red wave transitioned into a red puddle, I heard it described as. But it does look as though the Republicans will take control of the House. What do you think that means as it regards to American foreign policy?
Look, I think you're going to see more of an emphasis on China. One of the things that Leader McCarthy has said he's going to do, and key members of the caucus have said they're going to do, is they're going to have a China commission, and they're going to take a holistic view of how the U.S. is responding to the challenge being presented by the Communist Party of China and the challenge to our way of life, and how do we protect ourselves. So I think China will be a much bigger issue. And I actually think there's going to be bipartisan support for that commission. I think you're going to see a lot of Democrats who care about the Uyghurs. You're going to see a lot of Democrats who care about democracy being extinguished in Hong Kong. You saw Nancy Pelosi again. I'm not a big fan of Nancy Pelosi's most of the time, but I was glad to see that she went to Taiwan and supported our partners and friends there. So I think China's an area where we're going to be tougher and more focused, and where you're going to also see some bipartisan cooperation. So I think that's one thing. I think Ukraine's going to be fine. I think Europeans will be pushed by the new Congress and by the concern in the Congress to give more to Ukraine and become a true partner with the U.S. in fully supporting the Ukrainians defending their democracy and their sovereignty. So I think those are some of the things. I think you'll see more emphasis on the border wall.
Yeah.
And
Well, that was going to be my next quick question, was the fact that the border issue is not seen as a national security issue, and your thoughts that with this election, first, to what degree do you see the current state of the border as a significant national security issue?
Well, look, you've got human trafficking, you've got drug trafficking, you've got sex trafficking, you've got every kind of trafficking coming over the border you can imagine. The cartels control the border. The U.S. doesn't control the border. Mexican cartels, which are more powerful and richer than the biggest terrorist organizations and just as brutal, control the border. We don't. We need to take control of it back. I think that might be an area that there can be some compromise. The Biden administration opened the border as kind of a knee-jerk response to what they thought were unfair Trump administration policies on the border, and whatever that debate is, I don't think the answer was opening the border. It's wide open. But now you've got Democrats in this last campaign who are going to have to live up to their campaign promises. You've got Mark Kelly in Arizona saying, I was totally opposed to opening the border. I disagree with the Biden administration. I think you have a number of folks that realize that it's a potent issue with 2024 coming up. And I think, again, that's going to be an area where you can see some bipartisan cooperation. And keep in mind, when Newt Gingrich won the House became the Speaker in 1994, and the Republicans won the House, much bigger majority than the Republicans will have in this election. President Clinton, and we'll see if President Biden will do the same thing, but President Clinton came and said, what are the things we can work on? And we had deficit reduction, we had welfare reform, we had some immigration reform. So there was some bipartisan work that came out of the Republican Congress and a Democratic president. Hopefully we'll get some good policy out of this new divided government.
Neil Ferguson at the Hoover Institution has dubbed the era that we're in Cold War II as it pertains to our relationship with China. Do you see that as a helpful framing, at least for Americans to understand the current state of that relationship, or do you think that's overwrought?
Well, it might be underwrought. I think we're presented with a much greater challenge by China than we ever faced with Russia and the Soviet Union. You've got a challenge here that's a big one. The Chinese have a massive economy. They're smart. They work hard. They're clever. They're focused. They're Marxist-Leninists to the core. There's not going to be perestroika or glasnost in China. we're going to have to blunt this. And one of the ways we're going to do it is we're going to we're not going to have a non-aligned movement like you had in the Cold War I, where you had big countries like Brazil and India and Algeria that all decided to sit it out. I think you're going to see an alignment of democracies, of the big democracies, and if we're going to win, we're going to have them on our side, not just Western Europe, not just Australia, not just Japan, but we're going to need Brazil and Indonesia and India, South Africa eventually. That'll be a harder one because the Chinese are very embedded there. But we're going to have to see the democracies come together. The democracies that in the old days in Cold War I had the kind of luxury of having a non-aligned movement. That luxury doesn't exist today. We've got to pull the people together that believe in freedom and liberty and free markets, and those countries are going to have to stand up to the Communist Party of China because they're a challenge we've never seen before.
2 more questions. First,
And we'll win eventually, I think, as well. I think freedom has far more to offer the world than totalitarianism and dictatorship and tyranny. I mean, that's why the people of Ukraine are fighting so hard. They want to be, they don't want to be part of Russia. They don't want what Putin's offering. That's why the Taiwanese people don't want what Beijing's offering. We've got freedom is the right team to be on. We've got a good story to tell. And when you take Western Europe and Japan and the U.S. and Australia and some of these other big democracies, there's no way China can defeat us. We can potentially defeat ourselves, but the Chinese can't defeat us.
2 more questions. First, to tap on your experience preceding your time as National Security Advisor, Special Envoy, and Ambassador. American basketball player Brittany Griner is in Siberia someplace, or certainly under in prison in Russia. Obviously, I'm sure Americans and the State Department are, and maybe the person who followed you, who's in a similar position in the Biden administration, is trying to get her out. How do you view the prospects for bringing back Ms. Griner?
Yeah, so the Russians were very savvy when they picked Brittany Griner to make her a political prisoner. They looked at the Biden coalition, and they picked an African-American woman, lesbian, and knew that would put tremendous pressure on the Biden administration to give up a lot to get her back. And they made it very clear early on that this was not a cannabis, she had cannabis, but they made it very clear early on that this was not a criminal issue. This is a political issue, and they wanted something in return for her. And look, they were successful to some extent. You had LeBron James and Al Sharpton and others come out and criticize the Biden administration for not doing enough to get Brittany home. I can tell you because I know that the Biden administration is working very hard on getting Brittany home. They're going to get her home. There's the outline of the deal is there. The Russians want a guy named Victor Bout, who's a arms merchant and Lord of War type guy that we spent many years trying to track and capture. Eventually did. And they want him back, but they also realize that they've got something valuable with Brittany, and they're going to make it hard to do the deal. But the outlines of the deal are there. The Biden administration people are committed to it, and I have to say they've been very good on these hostage issues. Roger Carson's, Ambassador Carson's, who took over from me, Jake Sullivan, who took over from me as National Security Advisor, are committed to bringing hostages home. We just had a number of Venezuelan hostages or detainees that were held in Venezuela come home, and what I think was a good deal for the U.S. We gave up 2 and got 7 in return. So I think they're going to get Brittany back. I think they're doing generally a good job in the field. But the Russians are going to milk this, and they picked her specifically to make it difficult for the Biden administration.
Last question, and I'm going to draw, essentially paraphrase a question from Tira Rice. You've made a lot of sacrifices for this country. You continue to. We have agents here that attest to that. Can you, especially for our students, talk about the commitment that you and your family have made to the country and that you continue to make to this country? And frankly, why do you do it? Why have you done it?
Well, look, I feel like the luckiest person in the world to have been born in this country. I mean, it's the greatest country in the world, and I was a middle-class kid from Santa Rosa, California, and was able to do many wonderful things only because of the freedom I enjoyed and the opportunity I had to grow up in California and to grow up in America. And so I've been very blessed. My kids have been blessed. Both my daughters, one daughter's a pilot in the Air Force. The other's a JAG officer in the Army, reserve, and a deputy DA. And so I think they're committed to service as well. It was an honor and privilege of a lifetime to serve the American people as a national security advisor and in the other positions I've held in government. Excuse me, I've given like 8 speeches this week, so my voice is just about out. Going back to the time I was a first lieutenant in the Army, I was, I felt a tremendous amount of pride. I was just a reservist and had an undistinguished career in the Army, but just being able to put on the uniform was a privilege because I felt I was wearing the same uniform as heroes wore. And so look, for me, it's I don't think myself or Lomri or our kids look at it as a sacrifice, given what we've been given by the country. The other thing that I'll tell you is that makes you understand that whatever we've had to put up with is very minor. I used to go to Walter Reed because I got my medical care there as one of the kind of senior staffers, and I saw when I went to Walter Reed, I always try and go see the kids who were there, the soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who were there, and to see what they've given up is pretty sobering, and I haven't had to do anything like that. And the toughest days I had as National Security Advisor, I went to Dover 6 times for dignified transfers of remains for our fallen heroes. 3 times I represented the president, 3 times I went with the president. I can remember everyone. I remember every family member I met, and those were tough days. And those families made a big sacrifice. So what we did in comparison to what folks on the front line and our first responders do, and our military that are out deployed around the world keeping us safe is pretty minor. So I kind of the job of a lifetime and the privilege of a lifetime. I wouldn't change a thing, and so keep at it.
Well, Ambassador, thank you for your service, and on this Veterans Day, I think that's a perfect way to close our conversation together. Please join me in thanking Robert O'Brien. Now, I know the way this usually happens is that we are asked to remain seated as Ambassador O'Brien heads out towards the door there. But again, thank you so much for your time and for your example. I'm so glad that our students had a chance to hear from you, not only here, but last week at one of the classes that Dr. Skinner teaches here as well. But again, thank you for your service and serving as a senior fellow here with the School of Public Policy. Very grateful for you.
Oh, I'm honored to be here. It's terrific. Great to work with you, Pete, so thank you.
Great to see you.
God bless.
Thank you. God bless. Brian departs. Just a note that we are going to be gathering for a reception right out in Gulls Way patio. It would be great to chat with you all as we wrap up this evening's event. Our next event is actually next week, Thursday. Our annual Reagan lecture will be at the Reagan Library with our Reagan visiting professor. We have a lot of Reagans going on next Thursday at 11 a.m. with our Reagan professor, Robbie George from Princeton. We'll be giving a lecture on the importance of faith in the public square. So please think about joining us for that event. Again, 11 a.m. next Thursday, which will conclude with lunch at the Reagan Library. To the Tagliaferris, Michael, Karen, thank you so much for another wonderful evening in addition to the long list. Thank you.